Tonight's reading, well, had a lot to do with speech, right speech, living in the world, being harmonious with others, primarily being harmonious with ourselves first. And I have two aspects that I wanted to reflect on tonight. One of them is the difficulty of right speech for one such as myself and probably many people, and the harmoniousness with oneself and the idea of lessening the ego. So I was thinking that when she talks about unskillful ways of dealing with one's dukkha in the first section I read tonight, which has a lot to do with like running away from it or blaming other people or getting depressed about it, I have to think, well, that's been my life. One of the things she said yesterday was that if you tried to identify all of the problems, it could take up volumes. And I have volumes of my blog behind me, just like 10 books that I printed of my blog. And that was 5 years ago that I printed that. I have tons more writing now. And then primarily what my writing is about is talking about all my problems and the ways that I exist and the things that aren't perfect and my desires and hopes and wishes, which the way she expresses it through the Buddhist lens and her version of the Buddhist lens, it's all just not only worthless, but negative. And that I've lived my life in such a way, amassing ego trinkets that I can use later when I get old. I had this idea that I would go through life and have experiences and amass ego experiences in exquisitely recorded detail with videos and photos and writing. Hence what I'm doing right now. I mean, I can't just read the book because of my weird discipline thing. I just haven't been reading books for years. An aspect of this is sharing it with people, hoping that other people can benefit from this. But it also, I have an obsessive nature of sharing, and we live in a time like that, the Facebook and Instagram and taking pictures of lattes if you're that kind of person, and everything we do. I've been doing it for a long time. Differently than many, but it's the same thing. Just, recording all my thoughts and feelings and events. And in reading this, the reflection is that it's not only worthless. Like, even if I did set down to focus on it for years and process books out of it, which was the intention, books out of the photos, books out of the recordings, books out of the writings, or website even, that it wouldn't actually do any good for me or anyone else, because it's just me mucking around in my ego, and generally in very unskillful ways, trying to find a way out of the maze by making the maze more intricate over and over and over again. So that's very disheartening, and of course that's one of the unskillful ways of dealing with dukkha, is getting depressed by it, which is the way that I respond to things a lot of the time. And I don't really know how to parse that. I don't know how to make that okay, because it's like, I have all these books that I don't read, therefore they're useless. I have all these herbs that I don't take, therefore they're useless. I have this life that I'm not actually using in a useful way. Again, like with all this ego junk, I was hoping to serve. I was hoping to be useful, tell stories that relate to people and inspire them, but I don't know what useful thing I can do with my life and time. I don't have a passion that's just like joyful that I really want to do. Again, for many years I had sex and it was passionate and joyful, and I thought there was something excellent that I was learning that I could teach the world, and now I just don't think that anymore. Nor do I think that about my writing, nor do I think that about my photography, nor do I think that about acting, or even my visage, which was useful. So I don't need to go down that rabbit hole of talking about how my ego's useless. but just that I've amassed so much that now I'm just like, what do I do with this? So that gets back to all of that. It's about expression of myself, my ego. And that gets into the right speech thing that I, it's like my business, as it were, to talk. If I'm not this talking into a microphone and putting it on YouTube is not something I've done very much in my life. I've done it occasionally over the last decade, just occasionally, like a handful of times. So this project of doing this over the last 20-something days has been mostly reading, but just these last few days I've been doing these reflections and just conversations. Monologue conversations. It's not a conversation. But if you notice my style of, or if I notice, because that's what matters, my style of speech is not particularly weighed and deliberate. It's more of a rambling, it's a thought process, it's a stream of consciousness, which is how I write. And it makes me just want to be quiet, which is another reason I'm going on another silent retreat for 3 weeks and just kind of, very tempted to just go live silently forever and ever. And one of the other aspects I wanted to bring up was she talks about how, speech is only 7% of communication, and how somebody she knows, is making good business by talking about other levels of communication. When I first learned about the chakras and was doing a lot of drugs, I could feel the chakras opening up and resonating and connecting with people when I was having conversations with them. And I was very impressed by that the words very often served like a dog barking. It was just like words are just like rah, 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 rah. But the actual communication is happening on these multiple dimensions of connection between people. And it's not really dependent on space, in that if you're talking on the phone with someone, or if you're thinking about them, they can feel you. And this relationship that I had with this guy a few months ago, who, again, he was very unstable in his emotional, he was very emotionally reactionary. He would just like flip out about things in his mind and react and cry, and again, a lot of that I found actually, to be fair, my first response to him was beauty, love, attraction, and appreciation. But it was also tiring, and at times tedious, and at times frightening, because he would respond in ways that I would have no understanding of what he was responding to, because he was responding to a reaction inside of himself that was triggering off thoughts and feelings and memories that really had nothing to do with me or what was happening. But what I did notice, besides those, is that when inside of myself I thought about him, if I kept in my mind a love and appreciation with him, he stayed very love and appreciative. If I allowed myself to indulge in doubting him, fearing him, being tired of him, any of these negative emotions, any of these distancing, any of these giving up on him, any of these not loving and skillful emotions or thoughts about him, he would instantly respond to that. And these were not things that I intended to communicate. These were not things that I spoke of to him or thought of speaking of to him. They were just things I would think about him. I would, and I noticed this while I was with him in the same space, rather, when we were close to each other, when he was at work and I was walking around near him, but not actually with him, he would respond to me having doubts about him. Because I would, a habit that I have is that I'll be like, okay, I'm staying positive, I'm staying present, I'm saying blah, 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 blah. And then I'll have some time to myself where I'll be like, okay, so let's entertain the reservations. Let's entertain the fears. Let's entertain the doubts and see how valid they really are. So whereas that seemed like a healthy process for me to be real, to be present, to be like, okay, I have these doubts and these fears, but I'm keeping them over to the side while I'm with him because it's very important that I am only in a state of love with him. Then when I was alone, I would allow myself to experience the doubts so I could examine them. And then the next time I actually interacted with him in a physical space, I could tell that he was aware and responding to those doubts. He reacted to everything. So part of the Buddhist training, says, learn to not react, to not be emotionally dependent. He really wanted to be emotionally dependent. I mean, he expressed that to me before I even got out there. And so after I left, visiting him, even though we're thousands of miles apart, whenever I had when I would indulge in and be like, oh, he's so tedious, he's so tiring, he's so, because he would flip back and forth. I mean, there would be real actions that he would be doing that I would respond to. And I would allow myself to have an emotionally negative experience. And not to say that's more true or more important. It's certainly not more important than a state of loving. What it is not unconditional loving. I mean, it's not unconditional loving. It's not skillful to indulge in negativity. But at least for me, it seems like logically or habitually, it seems like a healthy thing, a healthy process to be like, well, I need to examine this to see if it's really worth caring about. Because if I just ignore it all the time, then that may lead me into a pitfall. And generally what I found was that I could look at the fears and the darkness and the splinters and the whatever, and as long as I return to, but I love him, then that was the important part. Like that it was kind of useful to be like, well, doubts, troubles, meh, but I love him. That's the important part. I'll just go back to that. And, in a relationship model, that's one of the things I did with him. What I find really attractive is the idea of somebody else giving you a reason to stay in a state of constant love. And what she's saying is don't make that dependent on anyone else. Make yourself your reason to stay in a state of constant love. Make everyone the reason to stay in a state of constant love. And it's a much better idea than making one other person. But there's a romantic ideal about pinning your heart on someone else and making someone else your reason for living, which is something I fall into a lot. But this all goes back to the idea of right speech, that you can have thoughts and feelings about someone, regardless of how much you're indulging in them, how deeply you're indulging in them, how serious you're taking your indulgence of thinking negatively, feeling negatively about someone, judging them, saying something to someone else about them. Doesn't matter. There's no time and space. So they feel it and it affects them. And that is very difficult for me. I'm not like the world's biggest gossip, but I do have a tendency to negativity towards myself. And I'm, in the last few years, really seeing how much allowing myself to think or say anything bad about myself in my mind, in my heart, in my passing thoughts, in my writings, how detrimental it actually is to me. And knowing that it's also detrimental to other people. So that's the experience I had with this guy who I was dating. And in fact, even the guy I was dating before that, I don't date people very often, but over the last year I tried to date 2 people. To disastrous effect. What I found was that I had, with both of them, there was like zero margin of error. The first one wasn't as bad as the second one, but they were both really bad. And when I say bad, I mean that whenever I allowed fear into my heart, they would just freak the fuck out, like immediately. And I'd be like, wait a minute. I'm just exhaling here. I'm just closing my eyes for a minute. This idea that, like, I'm not staying totally diligent in a state of love. That if I would ever just be like, I don't know, they are kind of like, I don't like the soap he uses. Both of them, I didn't like the soap they used. It's not a big fucking deal. But it's a critique, and it's okay to have critiques about things, right? Like, I don't like the texture of that fabric, or again, the Buddhists talk about, well, if you have likes and dislikes, then it's causing problems. So it's tricky. How do you live better if you don't use deliberation, if you don't say I like and I dislike? How do you live better if you're not making better choices? And we all need to live better. I mean, we can eat better food, we can say better words, we can act better ways, but in order to do that, we have to be able to say, well, this is better than that, which is different than I like this and I don't like this. But it's, there is, you can say, like, I like organic food and I don't like, genetically modified food. You can say that. But you can also say, well, organic food is better for the planet because it's producing less chemical byproducts and it's more ethical treatment of animals. And that's not always true, but let's pretend it is. You can say that it's ethically better, and that's why you like it. And of course, that gets into a why. Is that valid? And then if you ever indulge and, like, you look at someone you love and you're like, well, I love him, but I wish he wouldn't use that nasty chemical soap stuff because I don't like that. It doesn't, when I lick his skin, it tastes like gross chemical shit when I'd rather just taste his sweat. My experience. Maybe that doesn't hurt as much as thinking, I wish he didn't use drugs so much, or I wish he didn't have emotional freakouts about his neurotic worries in his own head. Like, I don't know, examining their personality as opposed to their habits. It's very tricky to me because I felt like with both of them I had zero margin of error. The second one I had much less margin of error than the first one. Zero margin of error was what I kept thinking, was that if I let up the love for any moment, it would just result in a disaster that required me to do damage control. And I felt like that was with the first one as well, that if I came to him in a state of weakness where I was like, I need compassion, I need putting back together, I feel like I'm falling apart, then it would trigger him, and then I had to do damage control on him in a time that I was specifically feeling weak. And one of my judgments and criticisms about myself, which I was going to write about tonight but didn't, was that, in examining the relationship of my past relationships, of feeling somebody allowing me to feel like a boy, somebody making me feel safe and allowing me to feel like a boy, led me into a state of being lazy, making me feel like, lover, I just want you to do everything for me. I want you to pay all the bills and wash all the dishes and cook all the food and make all the clothes and do all the laundry and clean the house, and I'll just... what will I do? I don't know. But I did notice I had this tendency that there was a part of me that was just like, I just want you to do it all for me. And I didn't like that, obviously. I didn't like it when I noticed it. I found it disgusting in myself. And that being said, I don't want to be lazy and act or ask or expect someone to do it all for me, nor do I want someone who makes me do it all. I want co-creation. I want partnership, right? How does that come back to the right speech thing? I mean, I think that somewhere in there, I mean, again, I don't like, she keeps using the terms right and wrong, and it's, she's talking, we're not, it's hard to do right speech. She's a person, we're all people, she talks about the arahants, we're not arahants. But she's not, the way that she'll talk about not saying right and wrong, and then she uses the terms right and wrong, and Um, anyway, these are just reflections. That's enough for now. I need to go to sleep. Love you. Mean it.